about water and urban places. This is Ideanthro. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Ideanthro. And welcome back to Front of Mind Season 1, where we nab ourselves a guest from this broader stormwater, water-sensitive city, water-sensitive urban design industry, and sit down for a chat about what is interesting them, puzzling them, possibly fascinating them at the moment. Our guest today is Kim Markwell from E2 Design Lab, and we are going to be talking about urban food production and broadly how urban water streams waste excess urban water streams could help facilitate that and why that might be interesting. As a little bit of context here, when I asked Kim, how would you like me to describe you on this episode? Kim was like, look, strictly I'm speaking of a freshwater ecologist, but likes to describe yourself as a practitioner in this something water sensitive space. Is that a fair description? And maybe this is because what's going to become apparent in this chat is that this is like a high level conversation bringing together multiple different fields.
Yeah.
And when I look at like you and E2 Design Lab, this is what I sense you and the company do, which is got a foundation in water and the environment, but then have these interests in like climate and energy and food and bring this all together into a pot. So I understand why that was a little challenging to answer perhaps. Okay, urban food and excess urban stormwater. Why don't you tell me the story that you were telling me just before off camera about doing some work in Victoria and where this topic first kind of popped up onto your radar, and then we'll take this conversation from there.
Okay. Started doing a whole of water cycle management project down in Melbourne, looking at a new urban area that that will be developed in the future north of Melbourne. And they had a whole lot of players around the table, including the water utility that had to obviously provide water and wastewater services to service that new community, as well as the local council. You had Melbourne Water there, you had the state government there, all the stakeholders in how water should be managed for this new urban population.
Yep.
You have a couple of waterways in this area that are currently ephemeral, which means that obviously don't get water all the time. And by putting in this new urban development, we know that that would increase the volume and the regularity of flows entering those waterways.
Which will fundamentally change the waterway.
Exactly. And so you had stakeholders at the table that really didn't want that to happen. So they pretty much put forward the objective of not releasing any excess water into the waterway. So when you start actually having a look at how much excess water is generated off a new urban environment, there's a lot in terms of breaking it down into roof water, stormwater and wastewater. And when you have a look at the total demands that you have from that urban environment compared to how much water is generated from that new urban environment, you actually have almost double the water produced than what you could possibly ever use in that urban water environment.
Gotcha.
So looking at normal recycled water demands in toilet flushing or irrigation, as well as even the potable demands in your open space
so this is,
kind of zones.
So from existing demands for water or conceivably easy to really obvious to implement additional demands. Like you might have a park that's not currently watered, but you could easily water it. You have twice as much water.
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure that even included if you were able to somehow provide potable water out of those. So say, in a rural town, you'll have roof water to potable, like even those sorts of things, you still have so much extra water. So this project was pretty much then saying, okay, we'll order some alternative solutions and really having a look outside of that urban area to see what other demands there could be.
Yeah, how do we increase demand dramatically?
Yeah.
Which is funny because normally water conversations are about how do we decrease demand? But anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
So it kind of just made it really obvious, I guess. Normally day-to-day in urban development projects, we just have to manage what the pollutants are or how the flows are actually entering a waterway. We don't actually have to think about harvesting and using that water a lot of the time.
Yeah.
So different solutions were put forward, and one of them, just because of the context of where we were, there was a kind of a green wedge right nearby that meant that urban development wouldn't happen there. It was preserved as agricultural land really, but it was kind of low value agricultural land at the time. The soil conditions weren't great. There wasn't a lot of water available.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the solutions was having a look at being able to provide, say, treated water to support a boost in, you know, the agricultural production, or whether or not you could even use hydroponics and those sorts of things there. So I guess it was the first time that a lot of those things had become obvious to me, and kind of that food water nexus, which when you think about it is quite obvious. You need water to support production of food.
Yep.
But in terms of my very normally urban environment space that I'm in, it was the first time that food was almost brought in as a key solution.
Gotcha.
So I guess that's the first time that kind of tweaked my interest a little bit.
Yep.
And so it's always been something that I've been thinking about. And
yeah, so this was, I mean, from what I gather, because we talked like a little bit about this like a couple of years ago, but never really sat down and had any detailed conversation. So this has been growing in your mind for what, 2, 3, 4 years, something like that maybe? Is that fair? So what are some options for how this might look like?
Yeah.
So, so it's one thing to say, okay, let's see if we can conceivably use waste urban water, excess urban, I'll say excess to capture both stormwater and wastewater, excess urban water to supply food production. But there's a few different scales of that, right? Because you could have household scale, me in my backyard. You could have community garden, like precinct sort of scale, or you can actually have fairly decent sized agriculture scale. How do you envisage this?
I think that it would be ideally a combination of all of them. And I think that at certain scales it is happening already. So I think some of those local scales, exactly. Like your own backyard, you'll normally have a rainwater tank going to your garden. Community gardens may have those sort of alternative water supplies as well. It's even moving into the commercial space now. So I was mentioning there's those rooftop gardens over in Montreal now, and they'll use just rainwater, and they obviously recycle a lot because it's a hydroponics based system. But that's a commercially viable business now, just by growing on rooftops and servicing green leafy vegetables to the local community. And there's examples in Singapore where they're doing it in vertical gardens as well, because they have quite constrained kind of space available. So that kind of smaller scale, bringing together that water and the food and the urban environment, I think it's quite an exciting space. But it seems to be very much driven by the community. I think my interest lies more in how could we actually bring it more into the urban planning and design kind of realm as well, so that all of a sudden in that peri-urban area where you're starting to see that encroachment of urban lands into agricultural lands, you know, is it starting to be able to reserve or value land to set aside for food production that helps close the urban cycle loop, but also kind of preserves really important city fringe food bowls. So like Melbourne and Sydney, I was mentioning, they've looked now at how much green leafy kind of vegetables are produced in those outer city areas at the moment. It's up to almost 90% of their leafy vegetables can be produced in those areas, but that's likely to drop, you know, 60 to 80% in the future just because of urban sprawl and the pressure being put on that land with population growth. And so I think that if we don't start at least even thinking about that potential in that realm, then that opportunity will be lost, I think.
And so when you mention that, what it reminds me of is visiting the Netherlands in each of the past 2 years, because what strikes me is, okay, sure, you go to Amsterdam or something and it's an enormous city. But you go to any of the smaller centres, and I've spent a fair bit of time in Delft recently, which is about an hour south of Amsterdam. And what you notice is very quickly on the train heading out of Amsterdam or out of Delft, depending on which way you're going, is how quickly you end up into agricultural land. And it's been described to me how apparently the Dutch are particularly good at preserving kind of these green belts around the cities, which I think is important if we're interested in this, in using excess urban water for food. The proximity of the food and the water is absolutely critical, which is, so it strikes me there's possibly a sweet spot here as we're heading in two different directions. So at the really small scale of a house lot, it's perfect in terms of proximity, right? It lands there, I use it right there, sweet. But from a governance point of view, great if you happen to be someone who's passionate about gardening and who's going to do it, but wide-scale adoption in a complex world where people have enormous amounts of different interests, the reality is that, in my opinion, probably not going to have really wide uptake. You go to the other end of the spectrum where you might have large-scale agriculture. Okay, sweet, that can produce heaps of food and use heaps of water if you can get the water to it, so you have a proximity problem. But somewhere in the centre, potentially is the sweet spot where that crosses over, where it's like, oh, we can produce quite a bit and the water's nearby.
And there's other benefits as well that you find in looking at the kind of those green belts, that preservation of land. So obviously it's just coming back to that food production, and especially if you're looking at the green leafy vegetables and those sort of perishable items. My understanding that obviously having those closer to the city centre means that you're reducing the risk of food waste or, you know, loss of that sort of food and associated with the food miles. But there's also the benefits of just even like urban heat island and those sorts of things by maintaining those sorts of green belts as well around a urban fringe. Obviously have those sorts of other benefits. It can then lead to habitat and those sorts of things. But yeah, I think that there's multiple benefits that you can derive from just having to think about whether or not there's value in preserving some of that land.
Well, and the other, so I mean, speaking of other potential benefits, this is not a topic that I've thought a lot about, but the one aspect of this which I have thought in detail about, and it comes from seeing, oh wait, that's a potential benefit, is obviously I have this strong interest in, okay, we're building all these stormwater treatment systems, how do we maintain them? How do we pay to maintain them? And about 3 years ago, I had a conversation over lunch one day with Brian McIntosh from the IWC, Andrew O'Neill from Healthy Land and Water, and an IWC master student whose name I cannot remember, unfortunately, I apologise. But we got talking about stormwater harvesting and urban food production, and it suddenly occurred to me that for local governments that have, say, a stormwater, well, actually, I'll leave that. I was going to say stormwater offset scheme, but that's really just the mechanism to build it. But there's potentially a sweet spot to build stormwater treatment systems, potentially green, like vegetated stormwater treatment systems, to treat stormwater. Okay, we want to do that anyway for environmental purposes. But the problem with that is, how do we pay to maintain them? On the other hand, if you can use some of that water from a harvesting scheme, potentially you can treat more water, get more of that water out of the system, benefits of reuse. You have an urban farm nearby, you're going to have a farmer on it. Well, guess what? That person is going to have horticultural skills, which are actually pretty close to the skills you need to look after a bioretention system or a wetland. A bit of modification. And this is to the extent where I actually spoke to a fellow who runs a small-scale kind of peri-urban community farm out at Sanford. And I was like, hey, I got this idea. Like, theoretically, I'm not actually going to ask you to do this, but theoretically, if you were in this situation and you had this thing, like, do you feel that you could do it? And he's like, yeah, sure, like, I might need to get used to it. But so I could see a sweet spot where potentially the revenue generated from an urban farm, and how to get the money flowing exactly in the right direction, but the revenue generated from an urban farm, plus the expertise of the farmer who's already there, could do the maintenance of the stormwater treatment system, and you're kind of closing this loop off a little, or maybe the farm would pay a portion of the maintenance for that and do the maintenance, and a little bit of it would be subsidised from the local authority who are also deriving benefits from pollutant removal. Like, it feels to me, that was my interest in this, because it could potentially contribute to solving the maintenance issue on all this stormwater treatment.
I hadn't thought about that aspect, but I think that's the benefit of having these sorts of conversations, though, I think, and all of a sudden just looking at urban water rather than just something that we have to treat to an acceptable standard to discharge somewhere. I guess I just kind of keep coming back to the point that even in environments where we're not dealing with an ephemeral waterway, which means we can't release the water, that's still a valuable resource,
well, and this is exactly
which I guess that's fundamentally what I keep coming back to, is just in any instance, you know, where we're dealing with urban water, what can it be used for?
And this is exactly, Mark Lieberman in New South Wales said exactly that to me. He was like, look, I'm totally fine with us protecting the environment, but currently stormwater is in a waste management paradigm. It's akin to throwing out your garbage.
Yeah.
It would be far better if it was in a resource management paradigm.
Yeah.
It's a big change, but it's a worthwhile one. So the other part of that, you know, stormwater harvesting for, you know, to urban farming, thing that caught my attention. Actually, the reason it really caught my attention was this obvious mechanism in Southeast Queensland at the moment to do it, which is you've got local governments like Ipswich taking offsets. It's a perfect situation, like that's the perfect mechanism to build such a system, right? Because there are, you know, a good amount of developer funds coming there for local governments to go and find efficient ways to remove pollutants from a waterway. It seems like a prime opportunity for someone to test it out and trial it, like to be the catalyst that goes, okay, let's put up the capital investment to make this happen and try and make this viable and learn from it. Essentially, it's the way to run a good first pilot study. And if it works, then people might be like, okay, we'll just do it in our own right.
And I think, again, that's getting people to think about it a different way, because I think that still in that offset space, we're coming back to the nutrient reduction, which is obviously where we need to start. But in terms of the nutrient reduction, we're always looking at, well, you know, can we stabilise creeks and improve, you know, their assimilation capacity and reduce the amount of sediment coming off them? Can we either retrofit stormwater treatment devices to remove those pollutants before we release the water? Whereas I guess the urban food kind of thing puts a different sort of solution in, because all of a sudden you're saying, well, the way that you deal with the nutrient reduction is by actually removing that water from the waterway in the first place, which I kind of, to me, just seems like where we should be trying to go first. It's almost kind of in your waste management hierarchy where you're looking at reduce, reuse, you know, then recycle, then
Well, and it's one reason why it could be a very cost-effective way to get nutrients out, because unlike, say, typical, say, bioretention, where it's like pollution comes in, yes, you remove some of it, but you're sending a fair bit of it back to the creek. You harvest it and it just disappears. That's why rainwater tanks are, you know, whenever you model a rainwater tank, and it's so effective because it just makes the water disappear.
And I guess the only thing that would have to get investigated further would be about, because obviously everyone, and I guess this is why wastewater a lot of the time gets looked at. So I was mentioning Whittlesea had put forward a solution of how you could manage wastewater in an effective manner to support peri-urban growth and things, because you've got a constant water supply that's available in the dry times when obviously irrigation's normally required more. And it's always been the argument that people sit there and go, oh, you know, stormwater you're harvesting when it's raining, you don't need the water then. So obviously the pilot would need to start having a look at what optimal storage size you would need and what that would look like. And that's kind of, I guess, where the cost would come in. But I think the fact that it's just not looked at the moment is...
But the flip side is, I wonder how many of these like urban farms actually, I mean, either draw from potable or already have a large storage. So the site out at Sanford where I spoke to the farmer is a ginormous tank on that you know, that they've got a grant to install out there. Well, that's an investment they're already finding a way to make. Exactly. So, you know, that's, so that's already part of it. Okay, one way that I'd like to test this, so something I'm thinking about more generally, I'm sorry, I have given you no warning of this question.
Awesome.
But one thing that I've been thinking about just more generally in stormwater treatment and is the topic of complexity. And what I mean by that is complexity within society. So you know Rebecca Brown's famous diagram where we go from a water supply city
to a water sensitive,
to a sewage city, drain city, waterways city, water sensitive city. And when I look at that, what I see is, at least in the first few steps of this, at least through to the waterway city, complexity being added. So there was a natural environment and we decided we want to live here. So we needed water. So we increased some complexity by adding water. But inadvertently, we start dumping waste products in the street. So we're like, okay, we need to fix that. So let's have a sewerage network. Guess what? That's more complexity because
Yep.
now we have water and sewer. And then we're like, oh wait, hang on, we've accidentally flooded the place and we need to stop that. Okay, let's drain the city. So
Yep.
suddenly we have water, you get where I'm going. And then most recently we've got to, oh wait, stormwater's having a negative impact on the environment, we need to mitigate that. Let's start building bioretention systems, wetlands and the like. And it keeps adding complexity. And I am concerned with my local government hat on. Like you sit in local government trying to fund these things and there is an unwillingness to increase rates.
Yeah.
And
Which I'd like to just even go back to that one step because I've always found it interesting, and someone pointed it out to me one time, that each time that level of complexity was added in the past, I guess people, the community have accepted that there needs to be a level of service improvement, and therefore to get that level of service improvement there needs to be a cost associated with that. And that's always been accepted. Well, I mean, I wasn't around at the time, but I'm assuming that
it appears that it's been accepted.
That was a big kind of call. But people were, I assume, were happy at the time to be like, well, I see the benefit in me having safe water to drink. So, and that there's a process behind that. So therefore I would need to pay for that service.
Yes.
Same with when you start agreeing to have sewered cities rather than, having to deal with it with your buckets out the back. Or, that people were willing to pay for that step level in service. And I kind of feel that maybe it is just because you start getting more and more removed from that outcome.
As you started
and
describing
that it's
this.
not also very well communicated to the community. So I kind of feel that we're kind of sitting in this transition zone where there almost needs to be that public acceptance that to get to a water sensitive city, there will need to be a step in level of service, which is likely to have some sort of cost involved in it.
Well, so this is where my question is going to, because I see exactly the same scenario where we get to this point where like eventually there's a finite amount of money that the community can invest in things. And I'm not saying either way whether we're at that at the moment or not at it at the moment. But when we're talking about any additional enhancement in the way we design a city, there's really either like you've got one of two options or blends thereof, which is either increase the amount of money to fund it, or you've got to find ways to do it within the current bucket of money. So a current test that I'm putting on this is the thing that we're proposing able to strip complexity out of the system somewhere else? So an example of this might be, say if someone was wanting to do better hydrologic management of urban waterways to protect the waterway and proposing some sort of whiz-bang infiltration system, could that decrease the complexity by meaning that we need less pipe work in the minor drainage system, for example? That would be an example of something that goes, okay, we're doing more, but we've actually removed something somewhere else, so net our complexity and our costs are pretty similar. Or is it something that's like, oh no, we're still going to do everything we're currently doing and plonk this thing on top, which means more cost? So that's the lens. So talk about this, in this context of urban food and excess water.
Well, I think that the project that I started talking about right at the start, when I said that you had all these stakeholders at the table and they were looking at how you would service this new urban community with having limited impact on waterways and those sorts of things. And so this is a slightly different answer maybe, but hopefully it kind of gets there. But it was interesting so obviously the water utility needed to invest in providing sewer and water regardless. So there's a certain capital budget that they have on the table that as a base case they would need to do. The interesting thing in that process is when you start adding these other complexities, or I guess other options, it may have ended up being a bit more of a capital cost to them, but we kind of undertook this full life cycle kind of cost benefit analysis to it, which was a really useful tool and process because it allowed you to understand what the costs associated with all our different options were and combination of them, which included food, the water to agriculture and a number of other solutions. But it then also allowed you to, and look, this is a still a contestable space, I guess, and not really resolved yet, but you started to be able to at least provide some sort of benefit value as well. And some of those are real values. So if you've got, say, an infrastructure offset cost, because it means that you're not having to upgrade your wastewater treatment plant straight away because, you know, you've got a demand all of a sudden, or you're reducing the amount provided. So that's like a financial benefit that you can kind of attribute. And then there's all those other non-monetary ones which you can start to provide a value to now. But it was interesting that having all the stakeholders there, seeing the cost increase for one party, but all of a sudden seeing the cost benefit being apportioned to other groups. I think that just even tools like that, without even having a look at if we're adding extra complexity or what the value is, all of a sudden being able to say, okay, well look, we can see that it's going to cost you a little bit more to do this, which may not be in your normal day-to-day business mode. So for you, if you looked at that just in isolation, you would go, well, why would we do that compared to this option, which is cheaper? But if the other stakeholders can start to see a financial benefit for them in it, can you almost start using that as a tool to start sharing
the question then
projects
becomes,
and stuff? So
how
it's
do
more
we...
of a governance kind of thing, that all of a sudden your water infrastructure, the primary cost bearer might not be the typical water utility or something. All of a sudden you have other stakeholders that are starting to, you know, contribute to that because there's a financial benefit to them. So I don't know, I almost think that there's some tools there that could help us understand, you know, where those sweet spots are, and allow you to put all options on the table, and for one person just to be able to go, oh no, well, I'm not doing that because it'll cost me more, or that's too complex, it'll just cost more, to actually delve into that a little bit more and see, you know, how are those costs and benefits shared, and is there a way that we can, you know, actually allow those costs and benefits to be shared equally across stakeholders in a real financial
Well, I mean, and it's
way.
a fair point, because so often projects don't get up, not because the project doesn't like stand up on its own accord, but because it doesn't, say, stand up, you know, because there are three parties involved, and it doesn't stand up for the one who's ponying up the capital cost.
Exactly.
Or sometimes projects get, or the flip side is that projects get up that make no sense overall, but which made a lot of sense for the person investing the capital in the project. Okay, so a little bit of a divergence there. Are there any aspects of this discussion that we haven't touched off on yet that you feel that we should have gone into?
No, I don't think so. I think for me it was just, I guess when I started looking into this a little bit more, I guess I got some confirmation that this isn't just a crazy idea of mine in isolation, that, you know, work is being done in this area a bit more, and especially in kind of Sydney and Melbourne, where those kind of city food bowls, it's been identified kind of in the papers and everything now, and through studies, just how at risk they are, and putting value on those. So I think that Melbourne have got that urban city food bowl resilience project or something, and they're actually trying to highlight that and put value on the importance of bringing together food, water, urban planning, waste management, so that they actually have a more sustainable future, and that doesn't get lost. So it is something that is generating, I think, a little bit of interest and movement. So I am hoping that it would be something that people talk about, I don't know, more and more in the future, or at least maybe even think about. And
so maybe this is a nice spot to wrap this up. So like on that note of, okay, let's hoping that people think about this and consider it some more, because I mean, for me, and this is a big part of why I do the videos, is because sometimes I think the most important thing is if we're just like tangential, like there's so many things in the world you could possibly know heaps and heaps about, but if you're tangentially aware about a bunch of interesting things, then when that potential project comes across your desk where that might be relevant, you can at least be like, okay, I've heard a little bit about that and I know to go here to get some info. So a nice way to end might be, and you've mentioned a couple of projects that we've gone through, but to just retouch on, what maybe are your three either most projects in this sort of space that you've heard of that interest you most, or other resources to go and look at? So I know you mentioned the garden in Montreal, and you've mentioned work being done in Sydney and Melbourne, but where would you, if people wanted to kind of see some of the resources that have got you interested in this, what would be the three that?
So I think to start with, from that kind of higher level kind of understanding of where that risk might lie and where that sweet spot might be. I think that the Melbourne Resilient Food Bowl, or whatever the program's called,
Google something of that nature. Fingers crossed it comes up.
I think that would be a first point of call, just to get an understanding, I guess, of why this is being looked at and what some of those solutions at a high level might be. In terms of on-ground solutions, and especially, I guess my head always goes to, helped run an event a few years ago where we were talking about urban farming, and most people have in their heads that it has to be just kind of, your own backyard or a community garden where it's all volunteers and those sorts of things. I'd really urge people to actually have a look at more where there's some commercially viable examples.
I think it's the only way to go, to be honest.
That. And there's more and more of them. So like I said, there's that one in Montreal, I can't remember the name of it, but it's Rooftop.
I'll try and Google these in my own right, and hopefully we'll be popping them up on the screen right now.
They've got rooftop greenhouses. There's that vertical wall one in Singapore, but there's so many other ones. Like there's heaps in the US where they're using rooftops to be able to generate all of the food for the local restaurants, and like those sorts of examples I think are just really nice ones. Again, they're from the ground kind of, they're from the community driven kind of aspect, but they're examples that it can be a commercial option, it can support local jobs, it doesn't just have to be this feel good.
And if they're commercially viable, then there's a model to go look at and to copy.
And what I would love is for that third example to be one in the future, or if people know of it, to let us know, is an example of where it hasn't been something that's just been found space in a city. So it hasn't just been a rooftop or something. I would love to see an example of where some value is placed on some urban land of some scale, and it might be in that peri-urban zone or a little bit more urban or a little bit more agricultural, where people have actually been able to bring all these elements together to create a commercially viable farm that supports jobs, provides local food, starts closing the water cycle. Like I haven't found that example yet, but that's the one that I'd love to know about.
And it's the key differentiator there in that one is something that's been more proactively planned with some foresight. Is that what sets that one apart in your mind?
Yeah, I think so, and just the scale of it. So it's going from just a small amount of space. Could it be something that is a little bit bigger? So it's not just the rooftop. Are there examples of where it's just that next level up in scale?
Gotcha. Okay, I love it. I think that's a really nice place to finish there. So Kim, thank you for taking the time to have a chat. If people are interested in this topic and want to find you and talk more about this, how do they track you down?
Well, they can contact me, I guess, through email is the easiest way, which is just kim@e2designlab.com.au. I'm always willing to have crazy conversations with people about all the random ideas that are spinning around in my head.
I love it. Okay, awesome. Thank you for the chat. Thank you as always for tuning in, and we will see you next time.
Thank you.
Before you go, our best episodes come from your questions. This knowledge base, these discussions that are Ideanthro improve with your contribution. So if there's a topic, an idea, a concept that you would like us to explore, come and ask us. You know where to find us. www.ideanthro.com/contact. You can find us on Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, and that place you get your good podcasts from. You know where to find us. We look forward to hearing from you. We'll see you soon.